There's a specific kind of tension that rises in certain people the moment they hear the words, "We're stopping by later." A tightness that has nothing to do with hospitality, nothing to do with liking or disliking the person who's coming, and everything to do with something far more revealing about how their mind and nervous system are actually organized. If you're someone who feels your stomach drop at the thought of unexpected visitors, someone who finds yourself mentally rehearsing excuses to keep gatherings short, someone who genuinely loves the people in your life and still dreads the moment they walk through your door, I want you to know today that this isn't a character flaw, isn't rudeness, isn't a failure of warmth. It's a window into something deep, something psychological, something that explains far more about who you are than most people ever bother to examine. Let's start with the obvious misconception first, because I think it needs to be cleared away before we can get to what's actually happening underneath. Most people assume that disliking visitors means disliking people, and this assumption is almost always wrong. The overwhelming majority of people who dread having guests over are not antisocial, are not incapable of connection, are not, in any meaningful sense, cold or unloving. In fact, many of them are deeply empathetic, deeply attuned, capable of profound closeness in the right circumstances. What's actually happening is something much more specific. Their relationship with their environment, with their sense of control, with the boundary between public performance and private restoration, is simply organized differently than it is for people who find visitors energizing rather than draining. And once you understand what's actually driving this reaction, the whole thing stops looking like a flaw and starts looking like exactly what it is: information, valuable information, about how your particular mind processes the world. The first thing worth understanding is that for a lot of people who hate having visitors, home isn't simply a location, it's a regulated nervous system state, one that took real effort to construct and maintain. Your home, if you're someone with this specific reaction, likely functions as one of the only spaces in your life where your nervous system gets to fully stand down, where nothing needs to be managed, performed, or monitored, where every object is exactly where you left it and nothing is asking anything of you. This isn't laziness or excessive control, it's regulation. And the moment a visitor enters that space, even someone you love, even someone you're genuinely happy to see, something shifts immediately and involuntarily. The space stops being purely restorative and starts requiring monitoring again. You become aware of how things look through someone else's eyes. You start tracking their comfort, their needs, whether they're too warm or too cold, whether the conversation is flowing naturally, whether there's an awkward silence that needs filling. All of this happens whether or not you consciously decide to do it, because for people wired this way, hosting isn't simply an activity, it's an involuntary shift from a regulated internal state to a monitored performative one, and that shift, however brief or well-intentioned the visit, costs something real. The second thing worth understanding is the specific relationship between this reaction and a person's threshold for sensory and cognitive load. People who dread visitors often have a nervous system that processes ambient stimulation, sound, movement, the presence of another consciousness in the room with unusually high intensity, even when they're not consciously aware of it happening. This isn't the same thing as simply preferring quiet. It's a genuine difference in how much bandwidth gets consumed by the presence of another person in your space, bandwidth that would otherwise be available for rest, for thought, for the kind of deep processing that happens specifically in solitude. When someone visits, even for a pleasant reason, even someone whose company you genuinely enjoy, a portion of your cognitive resources gets redirected automatically toward tracking their presence, where they are in the room, what they might need, how the conversation is landing, whether you've been quiet for too long or talked too much. For people with lower baseline sensitivity to this kind of load, this tracking happens so effortlessly it barely registers as effort at all. For people with a lower threshold, it registers as real, measurable depletion, even during an enjoyable visit, precisely because the depletion isn't about enjoyment, it's about resource allocation happening beneath conscious awareness. The third thing that reveals itself in this reaction is something more psychologically specific, and it has to do with early experiences around control and unpredictability. Many people who develop a strong aversion to visitors, especially unannounced or unpredictable ones, grew up in environments where their space wasn't fully theirs to control. A childhood home that was chaotic, unpredictable, frequently filled with people whose moods or behavior couldn't be anticipated, or alternatively, a home where privacy simply wasn't respected, where doors didn't stay closed, where personal space was treated as something available to anyone who wanted access to it. In either case, the adult version of this person often develops an intense, almost protective relationship with the idea of controlled space, space that admits people only on their own terms, on their own timeline, with enough notice to prepare both the environment and themselves internally for the shift a visitor represents. This isn't about being difficult or overly particular. It's a learned association between unpredictable access to your space and a loss of safety, one that formed for legitimate reasons and continues operating, often below conscious awareness, well into adulthood. The fourth thing worth naming is the specific exhaustion that comes from performing hospitality itself, separate from the actual presence of another person. Hosting, even in its most casual, low-key form, activates a kind of subtle performance mode for a lot of people. An internal script that says you need to be more animated than you naturally are right now, more attentive, more on than you'd be if you were simply existing quietly in your own space with no audience. This performance mode isn't dishonest or inauthentic. It's simply effortful, and effort, even pleasant effort, draws from a finite reserve. For people who already run with a smaller reserve of this specific kind of social energy, even a short visit from someone they love deeply can leave them feeling as though they've run a small emotional marathon. Not because the visit itself was unpleasant, but because performing the version of themselves appropriate for hosting required pulling from a resource that was already operating close to empty before the visitor even arrived. The fifth thing this reaction reveals, and this one might be the most important, is a person's relationship with their own need for restoration, and specifically how much they've learned to protect that need even when protecting it feels socially costly. People who hate having visitors often possess a clearer, more developed understanding of their own limits than people who never think twice about hosting, precisely because they've had to develop that awareness in order to survive their own sensitivity without becoming perpetually depleted. This is actually a sign of self-knowledge, not a deficiency in it. Someone who can accurately predict that an unplanned visit will cost them significant recovery time and who structures their life accordingly is demonstrating a level of self-awareness that a lot of people never develop because they've never had to. The discomfort isn't confusion about what you need. It's clarity about what you need, expressed through an aversion that can look from the outside like something smaller and less meaningful than what it actually represents. I want to address something directly here because I think it matters. This pattern gets frequently, unfairly, misread by other people as coldness, as unfriendliness, as evidence that you don't value the relationship enough to welcome someone into your space freely. And I understand why that interpretation happens because from the outside, dread looks a lot like disinterest, even when the internal experience is almost the opposite. But dread and disinterest are not the same thing, and conflating them causes real, unnecessary pain for people who are simply wired to need more preparation, more predictability, more control over their environment than the people around them require. You can deeply love someone and still feel your chest tighten at the thought of them arriving unannounced. You can be genuinely excited to see a close friend and still feel your energy contract the moment plans shift from "let's meet somewhere neutral" to "come over to my place." These reactions aren't contradictions. They're simply evidence that love and environmental comfort are two separate systems, and one doesn't override the other just because you wish it did. There's also something worth saying about the specific guilt that tends to accompany this pattern because I think it deserves real, honest attention rather than being glossed over. A lot of people who dread visitors spend enormous energy not just managing the actual visit, but managing their own private shame about dreading it in the first place, worried that their reaction makes them selfish, ungrateful for the people in their life who want closeness with them, somehow deficient in the warmth a good friend, partner, or family member is supposed to offer freely. I want to say clearly that this guilt, however understandable given how hospitality gets culturally framed, isn't actually earned. Wanting control over when and how your space gets entered isn't selfishness. It's a boundary, the same as any other boundary that protects a genuine, legitimate need. And needing that boundary doesn't diminish the depth of love or loyalty you're capable of offering the people it applies to. What's fascinating, and I think genuinely important to understand, is that this specific pattern often correlates with a much deeper capacity for meaningful connection than the more socially rewarded pattern of effortless, constant hosting ever does. People who guard their space carefully, who need real notice before visitors arrive, who structure their environment deliberately around restoration rather than constant availability, often bring a much higher quality of presence to the interactions they do choose to have, precisely because those interactions aren't happening from a place of chronic depletion. Someone who says yes to every unannounced visit, every spontaneous gathering, every open-door policy isn't necessarily more generous or more relationally healthy than someone who protects their space carefully. They may simply be someone who hasn't yet learned to notice their own limits, or who's learned to override those limits so consistently that the override itself has become invisible, indistinguishable from genuine ease. Meanwhile, the person who dreads visitors, who's had to consciously build systems around protecting their restorative space, often shows up to the relationships they've deliberately made room for with far more genuine engagement than they'd be capable of offering if they were running perpetually on empty. So if you recognize yourself in everything we've talked about today, the tightness at the thought of someone stopping by, the mental rehearsal of reasons to keep a visit short, the guilt that follows every instance of feeling relieved when someone finally leaves, I want you to reconsider what this reaction has actually been telling you all along. It was never proof that something's wrong with your capacity for connection. It was proof of exactly how attuned you are to your own internal state, how clearly you understand the specific conditions your nervous system requires in order to function well, and how much protective effort you've already invested in maintaining a space that lets you actually recover, rather than simply performing recovery while quietly, chronically, running on empty. That kind of self-knowledge is rare. Most people never develop it because they've never been forced to confront their own limits clearly enough to name them. You have. And that isn't something small. It's something worth understanding fully because underneath a reaction that looks, on the surface, like nothing more than mild social discomfort, sits something far deeper, a nervous system that knows exactly what it needs to stay whole, and a person who, whether consciously or not, has spent real effort protecting that need, even when protecting it meant carrying quiet guilt that was never actually deserved. That kind of self-knowledge is rare. Most people never develop it because they've never been forced to confront their own limits clearly enough to name them. You have. And that isn't something small. It's something worth understanding fully, because underneath a reaction that looks, on the surface, like nothing more than mild social discomfort, sits something far deeper, a nervous system that knows exactly what it needs to stay whole, and a person who, whether consciously or not, has spent real effort protecting that need, even when protecting it meant carrying quiet guilt that was never actually deserved. Now, I want to take this conversation somewhere more useful, because understanding why you feel this way is only half the picture. The other half, the part that actually changes how you move through your life, is learning what to do with this awareness once you have it. How to honor it without letting it quietly isolate you. How to protect your space without letting that protection calcify into something that costs you the closeness you actually want. The first thing worth understanding is that the goal here was never to eliminate this reaction entirely, and I want to be honest about that up front because a lot of people, once they finally name this pattern in themselves, immediately jump to trying to fix it, to force themselves into becoming the kind of person who hosts easily, who welcomes spontaneity without a flicker of dread, who never feels that tightness in the first place. This goal is not only unrealistic, it's actually misguided, because it treats a legitimate nervous system difference as a defect to be corrected rather than a trait to be worked with intelligently. You're not broken for needing more preparation than other people require. The work isn't becoming someone who no longer needs it. The work is learning to honor the need in a way that doesn't quietly damage the relationships you actually care about, and learning to communicate it clearly enough that the people who matter to you stop interpreting it as rejection. This brings me to the second thing, which is perhaps the most practically important shift available to you. Learning to name this pattern out loud, plainly, to the people in your life, instead of continuing to manage it silently through avoidance, excuses, or a carefully performed enthusiasm that costs you far more than honesty would. Most people who dread visitors have never actually said the true thing out loud. They've said things have just been busy, or maybe another time, or performed a warm welcome while internally counting the minutes until the door closes again. All of this protects the relationship from the discomfort of a direct conversation, but it also quietly starves that same relationship of the one thing that would actually make things easier for everyone involved: real information about what you need. Something as simple as, "I love seeing you, and I do best with a little notice before someone comes over. It helps me actually be present instead of just managing the visit." Tells the people who matter to you something true, something they can actually work with instead of leaving them to construct their own explanation for your hesitation, an explanation that's almost always less generous than the truth. The third thing worth understanding is how to distinguish, honestly, between protecting your genuine limits and using this pattern as a convenient shield against connection you actually want, but feel anxious about pursuing. This distinction matters, because not every instance of dread is pure nervous system regulation. Sometimes it's regulation, and sometimes it's avoidance wearing regulation's clothing, and learning to tell the difference is part of using this self-knowledge wisely rather than letting it quietly narrow your life. A useful question to ask yourself in the moment that dread arises is this: am I dreading the cost of hosting itself, the actual depletion that comes from performing and monitoring in my own space? Or am I dreading the vulnerability of being seen closely by this particular person in this particular context? The first is a legitimate need for environmental control. The second is something different, something worth examining rather than automatically protecting, because avoiding closeness out of anxiety and protecting your nervous system from genuine overload are not the same thing, even though they can feel identical in the moment they arise. The fourth thing, and this one requires real practice rather than simple understanding, is learning to build small, deliberate exceptions to your usual pattern, specifically with the people whose closeness actually matters most to you, so that your boundary doesn't accidentally calcify into a wall that keeps out exactly the connection you're trying to protect your capacity for. This might mean choosing one person, one relationship, where you deliberately practice tolerating a little more spontaneity than feels comfortable. Not because spontaneity is inherently better, but because relationships need occasional flexibility in order to stay genuinely close, and total rigidity, however well-intentioned as self-protection, can quietly communicate an unavailability you don't actually intend. This isn't about abandoning your need for preparation. It's about making sure that need doesn't expand, unchecked, into a barrier that separates you from people you genuinely regret losing closeness with, simply because you never practiced tolerating the discomfort of occasional unpredictability with the people who've actually earned that trust. The fifth thing worth naming is how to design your environment and your relationships proactively rather than reactively, so that the dread we've spent this entire conversation examining shows up less often in the first place. Not because you've suppressed it, but because you've built a life that requires less constant negotiation with it. This might look like establishing a general known expectation among your closest people that visits happen with at least some notice, so that the burden of asking for that notice every single time doesn't fall entirely on you in the moment. It might look like designating certain days or windows of time when you're genuinely more available for spontaneity, and being honest without guilt about the days when you're not. It might look like choosing to meet people in neutral spaces more often than inviting them into your home, specifically because neutral spaces don't require you to manage the specific compounding labor of both hosting and monitoring your own restorative environment simultaneously. None of these adjustments require explaining yourself extensively or defending your need as though it requires justification. They simply require you to structure your life around a truth you now understand clearly, instead of continuing to fight that truth quietly, exhausting yourself in the process, and then wondering why closeness feels so costly. I want to say something important here about the specific relationship between this pattern and genuine intimacy, because I think it gets misunderstood in a way that causes real, unnecessary pain. A lot of people believe that real intimacy requires total, unguarded access, that loving someone fully means welcoming them into every space, every moment, without hesitation, without needing preparation, without protecting anything at all. This belief isn't true, and clinging to it as some kind of relational ideal actually damages the very closeness it claims to protect. because it asks people to override genuine needs in service of an image of intimacy that has very little to do with what actually sustains connection over time. Real intimacy isn't measured by how little boundary exists between two people. It's measured by how honestly two people can communicate their actual needs to each other and how willing each person is to work with those needs rather than treating them as obstacles to be dismantled. A relationship where you can say plainly, "I need notice before you come over," and be met with understanding rather than offense is a far more intimate relationship than one where you silently override your own limits every time someone shows up unannounced, smiling through depletion because you've learned that expressing the truth costs more than simply enduring it. And here is something else worth sitting with. Something that I think reframes this entire pattern in a way that matters. The specific discomfort you feel at the thought of visitors isn't actually about the visitors at all. Not really. It's about the sacredness of a particular kind of solitude. A solitude that isn't loneliness, isn't avoidance, isn't a symptom of anything broken, but a genuine, legitimate form of restoration that a lot of people never learn to protect because they've never developed the self-awareness to notice they need it in the first place. You have that awareness. You know, with real clarity, what conditions your mind and body require in order to function well, in order to show up fully, in order to actually offer the people in your life something real instead of a depleted, managed version of yourself performing warmth it doesn't currently have the resources to generate authentically. That clarity is a gift, even when it's inconvenient, even when it requires explanation, even when it occasionally disappoints someone who doesn't yet understand why you need what you need. So picture this, the way we often close these conversations. Not a person hardening into isolation, not someone slowly closing every door until no one is welcome at all, but someone learning, slowly, deliberately, to open the door on their own terms, with enough notice to actually be present when they do. Picture the specific relief of finally saying the true thing out loud to someone who matters, and watching them receive it not as rejection, but as information, as trust, as an invitation to build something more sustainable than the performance you used to offer instead. Picture your home, still quiet, still yours, still a place that restores rather than depletes you, but now with a door that opens, occasionally, deliberately, to the specific people worth the effort that opening requires, rather than staying permanently closed out of exhaustion or permanently open out of guilt. Because that, in the end, is the real, quiet truth beneath everything we've explored today. You were never someone who dislikes people. You were someone who understood, long before you had the language for it, that presence requires resources, that resources require protection, and that protecting them wasn't selfishness, wasn't coldness, wasn't a failure of love. It was simply the quiet, necessary work of making sure that when you did finally open the door, whoever walked through it actually got to meet you, fully, rather than a tired, managed version of you running on a reserve that had already been spent long before they ever arrived.